I wanted to do a review of my persistence model here. Let me close some things and talk about how we save data. Open up our priv folder to see our table migrations. So we have a space. The space has an ID, name, description, and some settings, which can be some arbitrary JSON object or key value pairs. And then we have entities. Entities are the things inside the space, and so currently they belong to a space. And this is sort of a tree because you can have entities that are nested under other entities. And an entity is basically an ID, and it has a kind of type, which I've been using for different kinds of primitives, like a box, cone, etc., cylinder. And you can give it an optional name. And entities, to help me be able to query entities, I started this thing called tree paths, but currently it's not an active thing. So I may or may not get rid of this. Not sure yet. This would be useful for maybe a UI where you needed to query a portion of the tree. And in fact, I've totally forgotten how to use this, so I need to review my own videos. Then entities have many components. So these are the data on the IDs. So entities themselves are also just IDs. Components are little buckets of data that are associated under an entity. So they belong to an entity. And then there's a bucket of data and there's a type. So there's a unique pairing between an entity ID and a type. So you can have things like color, position, rotation, and scale. And then you have so each one of these components, each one of the entities have sometimes 3 for position, rotation, scale associated, and maybe a color that's currently supported. And then we have a table for collecting the events. Since it's an event sourcing pattern, every kind of message that we get is funneled into this table. Now the thing I wanted to kind of explore was this idea, is that when we're creating a space, it makes sense that you associate things in the space, the entities, with the space. But then, when you're playing the game live, that entity might be temporarily moved, but you don't want to disrupt the permanent location that it's in. So it kind of has like a kind of component that you can edit, and it would be persisted, which maybe that's here. And then on here, maybe it has kind of a temporary version. So does that mean we then have 2 sets of components? Like one component that belongs to the entity, and maybe another. So maybe I'll write some notes here. So here's my thinking. So we have a space has many entities. These are the things. And entity has many components. But when you're editing a space, you modify entities, right? You create them or you delete them. And you also update or create components for entities. And that's as a host. As a host editing a space, But then as a player, you might have different access so that maybe you can pick up the same item and then you can throw it across the room when the host isn't there. And so you shouldn't be able to permanently modify the space. That thing should maybe respawn in the area it was in. But for the duration that you're in there, it's like you did move it. So something like that might be ammunition. So you collected the ammunition, and we might want to have some rules about when that ammunition respawns. So maybe once you've picked it up, it's kind of temporarily gone. So it's like we need another set of entities such that when players load the stuff in the space, they load it from this alternate set of entities, some of them which might be deleted, or maybe you just mark them as deleted. So you get a alternate set of entities. This reminds me of Docker and Docker images and Docker containers, where the data for a container, it actually comes from the image. So you're kind of editing the image here, and then when you play it live, that data is inside the container, but any changes you make inside the container, it does a copy on write, which means it makes a copy of that file that you're editing, and for the duration of that session, it persists it. But then if you close the session and open a container again, it goes back to the way it was. So one way to do this is add some marks on top of the existing entity. Then we just add to the current data store. Maybe the components has a list, a map in here, a list or a map for all the components, position, rotation, scale. And then also deleted. An alternate thing would be that we have a separate set of records, but then we'd have to use the same ID, and that might be okay because the ID is created client side. So we could have an alternate table with the same UUIDs. So then we'd have editing space, you have entities and components, and as a player, when modify entity, so you are either deleting them or their components, update component, so you're changing the position, rotation, scale, etc., that you are populating another table. So it's like space, entities, space, maybe it's called space changes. I don't know what to call this thing. Entities, maybe you have what do you call shadow? When you shadow the original, you or override entities. So these shadow these, And so maybe you have override components. So whenever you're modifying something, you're going to copy it, copy on write into another set, and you hide the original set. So as a player, you load this set, overriding entities. That means we need, no. As a player, we're going to load all of this and all of this on top of it, in which case this data will overwrite that data. So that this data might not have to be the entire set, it's only what's changed in this session. Then finally, at some point, we will reset the world, in which case we delete entries from the override tables. And what's left is what the host created. And so we can reset the world when the space has been inactive for a while. So after gen server terminates, or maybe just after some time, or after all members have left. That seems like a good one. After the room is abandoned, put it back the way it was, because nobody's left to wonder, hey, why did the room change on me? If everybody leaves, put it back the way it was. So I like this one. So if you want to start the game over, just everybody leave. Or we can have a button to reset the world, or yeah. So if they're playing while the person is editing, so he's up here, host, is creating some things, and a player comes in and starts, like, picks up a gun and starts shooting it. Like if the host laid the gun down and said, oh, I want all the guns to be here, and the other person comes and moves them and changes them. First of all, we need different permissions. So Unix file permissions are read, write, and execute. So read means it's visible. Write means you have edit permission to change, delete it, and execute, let's say, has permission to interact with it. That means pick it up, shoot it, but you'll go into the copy on write table, the override table, and it's not a permanent change to the design of the room. So after everyone leaves, it will go back. And so if the host is also here's where it gets tricky. So the host puts it down in one space. Then a player comes and picks it up and shoots it. But to the host, should they have seen that it moved? Maybe they do, but they might be confused as well. I would say that the host, when they're editing the space, when they're in edit mode, they see the object where they put it, and if somebody comes and grabs it, they see a ghost version, a kind of transparent version parented to the hand of the player, but the original version still stays there for them. But if they exit edit mode and they go into play mode, then because we're going to play these and then play these on top of them, because it's the same ID, it will overwrite and then it will appear as if it's in the player's hand. But if they're in edit mode, when somebody comes to grab it, we can't use the same ID, otherwise it would collide. It will fight. It will query the same entity ID and then it will be modifying it. So we need an alternate set of IDs. So these should be not using the same IDs. Maybe they should be using an alternate set of IDs. If it's an alternate set, you could just simply tack something on it. So we have a couple of scenarios here. Player initial load of scene. You load original entities, maybe optimize mesh, maybe create, load the nav mesh. Then you load the override entities, and here you just directly override them. You don't need an alternate version. These are your current versions. Okay, and then you wouldn't need to know the wiser. Any message that you get now, it's using the entity ID. But when the host, or maybe we could just have two sets of messages. That might be better. I think that would be better. So okay, we still need this, but host initial. Okay, so not host, but player goes into edit mode. And so what happens is modifications to the space use alt set of messages. So that makes sense because you're using transform color. This will change the persistence. But over here, when you're just using grab, release, and so this will go into the override tables. But if over here, if you do grab and release, you'll save in the entity and component tables. Does this make sense? And if a user, and then finally if a player, a member in non-edit mode grabs the entity, that would be confusing. It's like they're editing it. We'll have to do a split here. Maybe when you go into edit mode, you need to reset the scene with entity ID and alt entity ID. So if you grab the alt entity ID, you're also not modifying the scene. Modification to the space only happen on entity ID. Member non-edit mode only sees the alt entity ID version. So I think this and this are the same. We've got to load. So you load the set of things, but when you're in edit mode, you have to split them. You keep the play mode because you can still play with it, but you load an alternate set of editable versions on top of that. Or something like that. Let me think about this.